of UK media coverage of Israel and European anti-Semitism. This evening's critical program was planned weeks before the terror attacks targeting Jews at a kosher market in Paris and at a synagogue in Copenhagen, in which 5 were murdered. Recent events underscore the urgency of tonight's topic, and I thank you for coming to learn what we, members of the concerned public, can do to promote accurate and responsible coverage of Israel. My name is Tamar Sternthal, and I'm Director of CAMRA's Israel Office. CAMRA, or Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America, is a research, media monitoring, and activist organization of 65,000 members which leads the fight against anti-Israel media bias. Founded in 1982, our mission is to ensure that media outlets adhere to their own professional codes of journalistic conduct. Along with our Boston headquarters, we have additional offices in half a dozen American cities, as well as here in Jerusalem. In recent years, CAMRA has greatly expanded its global reach by establishing our British department, which is comprised of 2 blogs, BBC Watch and UK Media Watch, our Spanish division, Revista, and our Hebrew division, Perspectiva. Our record of success speaks for itself. CAMRA has prompted literally hundreds of corrections and erroneous reports in print, online, and on the air. In the last month alone, our various branches have prompted corrections in numerous media outlets, including the New York Times, The Guardian, Times of London, Walla, Israel's Channel 10, Haaretz, and USA Today. Most recently, CAMRA prompted an Al Jazeera retraction of its report last week, which had falsely claimed that Israel flooded Gaza by opening dams. Likewise, CAMRA's extensive correspondence with Agence France Presse led the French news agency to pull its video making the same false charge. On Friday, AFP also published a comprehensive article on, quote, the shattering of a long-held Palestinian myth, unquote, about the flooding. Our researchers also set the record straight by penning op-eds in a variety of leading media outlets, by appearing on television and radio, and also by communicating privately with journalists. The impact of our talented professional staff is enhanced by the critical work of our dedicated volunteer team. Thousands of letter writers who advocate for fair and professional coverage of Israel, and whose letters are published in national and local media outlets, reaching a vast audience. This evening's program features CAMRA's British department, UK Media Watch and BBC Watch. UK Media Watch, formerly SIF Watch, was founded independently in 2009 and merged with CAMRA in 2012. SIF Watch's founding mission, to monitor the Guardian, has since expanded to combat anti-Israel media bias in many more British media outlets. Its new name, UK Media Watch, reflects that expanded mission, and tonight's program marks the launch of the new brand. BBC Watch, founded in 2012, promotes accuracy and impartiality in BBC coverage of Israel. Its analyses prompt improved BBC coverage and assist members of the public in the compilation of their own complaints relating to BBC content. I am delighted to introduce Judy Lash-Ballant, tonight's moderator. Judy is a Jerusalem-based journalist and host of the Jerusalem Diaries show on Voice of Israel Radio. Judy is also a staff member at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs and the author of 2 volumes of Jerusalem Diaries, Intense Times. Her reporting from Israel has appeared in the Jerusalem Post, Seattle Times, Haaretz, New York Post, Moment Magazine, The Forward, and many other publications. Judy was born and raised in the UK and holds bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Washington. Prior to making Aliyah in 1997, Judy served as director of the Coalition for Jewish Concerns Amcha, headed by Rabbi Avi Weiss. Judy, I turn it over to you.
Okay, so good evening, everybody. It's very nice to be here, and kol hakavod to UK Media Watch. I was born in the UK, actually, post-war. My parents were refugees who came from Europe. And I have to say that I experienced absolutely no anti-Semitism at all in Great Britain of those days. And my guess is that several people here in the audience are of the same vintage or grew up in the UK in those years or later and maybe experienced the same things. However, it strikes me that actually what went on in that 50-year period post-Shoah up until relatively recently was actually much more of an anomaly than what was actually real. And what we're experiencing today is pretty much back to what has existed in previous centuries, it's sad to say. Now, I don't think it's a surprise for anybody in this audience. You've probably all seen the same reports that have been circulated in recent months. But a number of those reports have been about anti-Semitism in the UK, of course, have raised great concern. One is the Community Security Trust, which is the kind of volunteer group in the UK that deals with security issues in the Jewish community. And their latest figures on anti-Semitism are really astonishing. Again, I'm pretty sure you all know this already, but 2014 saw the highest levels of anti-Semitism in the UK since they had started actually monitoring, and that was in the 1980s, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Hate crimes against British Jews have doubled in 10 years. Now, we have not seen in the UK the lethal kind of anti-Semitism yet that has occurred in France or in Copenhagen, but the atmosphere, and I think probably, again, many of us in this room have friends who are British Jews. One of my favorites is the author and commentator Howard Jacobson, the author of The Finkler Question, the closest thing you could say that British Jews have to a prophet, a modern prophet. And he has written the following, which again just resonated for me after conversations that I've had with many, many people in the UK. The criticism of Israel is of such a pitch that it does feel like a kind of persecution, he says. It's ugly to be a Jew living in any country when that is what people are talking about all the time. Anti-Israel is what he's referring to. Fear that the vehemence of anti-Zionism of the elites, and that's something that's extremely British, I think, combined with the Muslim anti-Semitism of many in the Muslim community, not everybody obviously, could one day in fact become lethal. And all this has fueled, I think, this creeping unease that we have sensed from our British Jewish brethren, and my relatives certainly, that has infected British Jews over the past several years. Now, the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism is a relatively new group in the UK. They also wrote a recent report. They're an independent group, and they might have a slightly different perspective. They said Britain is at a tipping point. Unless anti-Semitism is met with zero tolerance, it will continue to grow, and British Jews may increasingly question their place in their own society. Now, if you would have told me that, 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, or to tell my parents that who were saved by Great Britain, lo human, as they say. I mean, that's absolutely inconceivable. But that is the status of things today. So, how to fight it? Obviously, for those in the UK, we need to encourage them to provide better education. Obviously, better education against anti-Semitism. Better education of Jews, young Jews particularly, so that they know the facts. They know how to counteract things that are clearly not correct. Stepped up security. All those are things that can be done over there. But what about being proactive and getting to one of the main influencers of public opinion? And that, of course, I think in the view of most of us, is the media. The media are the ones who are promoting public opinion and are the shapers of public opinion. And just a few weeks ago, the all-party parliamentary inquiry, an official body into anti-Semitism, published their report, and they did call out the media, and in particular the BBC, as I'm sure we'll hear from in a little while, as having a role in whipping up anger through emotive content in the news and analysis that was broadcast. This is an all-party parliamentary inquiry, not a Jewish inquiry. And in fact, 80% of British Jews surveyed do believe that the media is fueling anti-Semitism. 80% of Jews. UK Media Watch, as we've heard, has for some years been leading the fight for accuracy and a lessening of the vocabulary of hatred. Something that I think we all should be supporting, and again we'll be hearing about more today. So we're not here to debate whether or not British Jews should make Aliyah, but rather to consider the question of whether the media is the prime influencer of attitudes toward Jews, and does it in fact fuel extremism? Is there a way to influence major news outlets to avoid inaccurate reporting and sensationalism? Is it the media that has shaped the anti-Israel views of the chattering classes? Is there any hope for the media to moderate the anti-Semitism of many in the Muslim community in Britain? All these are questions that I hope we'll get to, and our panelists are extraordinarily well qualified to weigh in on these issues. Before I introduce them to you, just a few words about the format this evening. Each of our panelists, I will introduce them, of course. Each one will speak for between 15 and 20 minutes, and then we will have, they'll address the particular topics, and we'll leave a good half an hour for your questions. And I will be, with my lash, I'm going to make sure that each speaker knows when they have 5 minutes left, when they have 1 minute left, so we will keep it running as clockwork, hopefully. So let me introduce first our first speaker. Adam Levick is the managing editor of UK Media Watch, formerly CIF Watch. He's been in that role since 2010. Adam previously worked as a researcher at NGO Monitor here in Jerusalem, and prior to that he worked in the United States in the Civil Rights Division of the National Office of the Anti-Defamation League. Adam is a member of the online anti-Semitism working group for the Global Forum to Combat Anti-Semitism, and he has published reports on anti-Semitism for the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, and his op-eds and articles have appeared in many, many publications. Adam holds a degree in political science and history from Temple University, and he made Aliyah in 2009. So Adam, you're going to be speaking about if the UK's media narrative of the Arab-Israeli conflict is to be believed, Israel not only engages in gratuitous violence against Palestinians, but disproportionately targets innocent children. Do news articles, headlines, and images depicting dead or injured Palestinian children, sensationally presented by UK news sites, evoke classic anti-Semitic motifs? The podium is yours.
Yeah.
Oops, didn't notice me yet.
Now, when I speak about anti-Semitic motifs, one of the anti-Semitic motifs. Sorry, one of the anti-Semitic motifs that we're going to talk about tonight is the anti-Semitic blood libel. Now, the blood libel is the allegation that Jews murder non-Jewish children to use their blood for ritual purposes, such as baking matzah or baking challah. The first blood libel in Christian Europe was in 1140 in Norwich, England. Norwich, sorry. The American in the panel. From the 12th to the 16th century, there were over 100 blood libels in Europe, many resulting in the massacre of Jews. You're familiar with the Damascus blood libel of 1840. There was a blood libel in Ukraine in 1913. And even in Massena, New York in 1928, the United States, there was a blood libel. Variations of the blood libel are ubiquitous in the Arab and Muslim world today. Most of which have morphed to impute this kind of malevolence, this kind of evil, this comic book villainy to Israel as the Jew writ large. Look at this cartoon. This was published in 2009 after Operation Cast Lead in a Qatar news site called Al Raya, depicting Israeli actions during the war. And you see the demonic Jew eating a Palestinian child. It couldn't be less subtle. The blood dripping from his mouth, the just sinister, evil look in his face. And any of you familiar with Palestinian Media Watch or Memory or any of these sites that translate and report on the Arab media wouldn't be surprised. But I thought this was interesting because this is just the most obvious example, and this is what people in the Muslim and Arab world are exposed to all the time. How bad is it in the Middle East and the Arab world? I'm quoting Robert Wistrich, who will be here shortly. He wrote this in Haaretz 2 years ago. He said, "The scale and extremism of the literature and commentary available in the Arab and Muslim newspapers, journals, magazines, caricatures, on Islamist websites, on the Middle Eastern radio and TV news, in documentaries, in films, and educational materials, is comparable only to that of Nazi Germany at its worst." So the question is to what degree this anti-Semitism, this extreme anti-Semitism has seeped into the UK media. Some of you may be familiar with this image. This was a cartoon that was published in the British Independent in 2003. Now, not only was it published in a respectable newspaper, but it actually won the coveted UK Media Cartoon of the Year at a ceremony held at the offices of The Economist. You can't get much more establishment than that. This wasn't a marginal, this wasn't a tabloid, this wasn't something that was published somewhere in an extreme website. This was The Independent, which is one of the leading newspapers in Britain. And I want you to pay really close attention to the caption. It says, it's obviously Ariel Sharon. This was during the First Intifada when Palestinian suicide bombers were going into Israeli cities and killing our children. The caption says, "What's wrong? You've never seen a politician kissing a baby before?" Note also the vote Likud. Note also the helicopters. It says Sharon, vote Sharon. The implication is clear, right? The implication is that not only did Ariel Sharon, the Jewish Prime Minister of Israel, not only was he killing Palestinian children, but to do so was a vote-getting technique. That somehow this is a popular policy amongst Israelis. It's not only imputing it's not only imputing evil to Ariel Sharon. It's imputing evil to Israeli Jews in general. If you remember in 2009, a Swedish tabloid by the name of Aftonbladet published one of the first modern-day blood libels in a respectable European publication. It basically charged that the IDF purposely killed Palestinians so that they would harvest their organs. We got a lot of publicity. This was a huge story at the time, but a couple months later, after the controversy died down, The Guardian, this is in 2009 in December, The Guardian had a headline that said, "Israel admits harvesting Palestinian organs." Now, the headlines, to give you a little background, headlines are written by sub-editors, so it's unclear who wrote the headline, but it's fascinating because even The Guardian was forced to retract the headline when they admitted that there's nothing in the article that even remotely demonstrated that Israel admitted to harvesting Palestinian organs. That that somehow in the imagination of one of these editors, this was something that was conceivable. In 2009, there was a play written by a woman by the name of Carol Churchill called Seven Jewish Children, some of you might be familiar with. It was also a British play in response to the Gaza war that was performed at no less place than the Royal Theatre in London. In this play, it's quite remarkable. I mean, Jews in the play confess to killing Palestinian children. Jews, qua Jews, not Israelis. They confess to a project of genocide. A video reading of the play is available at The Guardian's website. It's permanent content to this day. Even worse, actually, The Guardian used a photo to illustrate the play on their website. Kind of the photo you see in a YouTube video before you actually get to the video. It's to illustrate what the video is about. It actually showed the part of the Passover Seder where Jews dipped the wine representing the plague of slaying the firstborn, as if to suggest what the source of Israeli violence targeting children is in Judaism itself. Quite remarkable. And The Guardian's one of the most widely read papers in the UK. 2013, you might remember this also, this had a lot of publicity. On Holocaust Memorial Day, the Sunday Times, now for those of you who don't know, the Sunday Times, part of the Times of London, is actually one of the more pro-Israel newspapers in the UK. Their cartoonist, however, had a very interesting take on our security fence. The cartoonist's name is Gerald Scarfe, and as you see here, you see a bloody trowel-wielding Netanyahu torturing innocent souls, including children. The inversion is actually quite remarkable. A security fence created for one purpose and one purpose only, to protect against suicide bombings which kill Israeli children, suddenly morphs into a cruel weapon against Palestinian children. Note just the moral inversion is remarkable. For those of you that followed Operation Protective Edge in the UK media, as Judy noted, you'd be forgiven for believing not only that Israel, the IDF, intentionally killed Palestinian civilians in Gaza, but that they took particular pleasure in targeting children. One front page Guardian print article on July 30th said that the title was "The World Stands Disgraced." You see an injured Palestinian child. But if you look closely at the bullet point, it actually gets worse. It says, I think you can see, nothing is more shameful than attacking sleeping children. The Guardian actually found something worse than killing innocent children, killing sleeping children. August 1st, during Operation Protective Edge in The Independent, the columnist actually referred to Israel as a child-murdering community. A columnist by the name of Mark Steele, a British commentator and socialist political activist, he was essentially mocking arguments that the media wasn't providing Israel fair coverage and wasn't giving the Israeli point of view. He wrote, "At last it seems the mood is changing, and finally we're beginning to hear the child murderer's point of view." The Jewish State in 2014 called a child murderer by a columnist in a respectable paper. So where does this lead? Well, we do know that Islamist extremists often cite Israel's murder of innocent Muslims to justify their attacks, and in 2012, you might remember, a jihadist in France by the name of Mohammed Mourad murdered a teacher and 3 small children, including one small child who he put a gun to her head and pulled the trigger at a Jewish school in France. And in the letter he wrote, kind of his pre-suicide note, he was very clear that he did that to avenge the murder of children in Palestine. So, when we talk about anti-Semitism in the British media, I want to be clear because sometimes people have misconceptions. When we talk about anti-Semitism in the media, we're not claiming to possess some sort of piercing moral intuition which grants us access to the souls of journalists. We can't determine with any degree of certainty if they're haunted by dark Judeo-phobic thoughts. Rather, many of us who talk seriously about anti-Semitism are simply identifying common tropes, narratives, and graphic depictions of Jews which are based on prejudices, stereotypes, and mythology, and which have historically been employed by anti-Semites. Though I'm now an Israeli and have been proudly for the past 5 years, an apt analogy can be derived by recalling my experience growing up in the U.S. Those of us here who grew up in the U.S. know, who inherited the moral legacy of slavery and segregation, understand that we owe African Americans a commitment to avoid employing the linguistic, cultural, and political currency of racism's ugly reign. That is, though race relations have matured immeasurably over the years, there are nonetheless unwritten prohibitions against language and imagery which evoke the haunting memory of America's past sins. In America, for instance, comedians would never, ever do blackface routines. A mainstream newspaper would never publish a cartoon depicting an African American as lazy and shiftless or eating a watermelon. And someone using the N-word, as we all know, would rightfully be stigmatized as a crude racist. Such political taboos in America have developed organically over time in response to a quite particular historical chapter, and are recognized by most as something akin to an unwritten social contract on the issue of race. Though white Americans obviously can never fully understand the black experience, it's, I think, reasonable to expect that they not recklessly aggravate the pain of their shared historical memory. Further, whites who honor this implied covenant, that is, they avoid evoking such narratives and imagery, typically don't bemoan the so-called restrictions placed on their intellectual expression, nor do they complain that African Americans are stifling their free speech. Rather, such unwritten rules about race are typically understood to represent something akin to a moral restitution for a previous generation's crimes. While the First Amendment obviously affords legal protection to those who would engage in hate speech, it's understood that responsible U.S. citizenship often requires self-restraint. And as many of us know, our Jewish tradition teaches us that greatness is often measured by what we are permitted to do, but we decide not to do in order to preserve a sense of harmony. In Judaism, it's called shalom bayit, to keep the peace. So, therefore, how does this relate to Jews in Britain? When Jews in Britain or elsewhere talk seriously about anti-Semitism in the media, they're asking elite opinion leaders to avoid needlessly poisoning the political environment in which Jews live. We're appealing to the better angels of their nature by asking them not to carelessly conjure calumnies such as the danger of Jewish power, the charge of dual loyalty, or the libel that Jews intentionally spill the blood of innocents. In short, we're asking that decent people avoid employing canards which incited the historic persecution of Jews and which tragically still have currency today. No, we are definitely not blanketly accusing the UK media of anti-Semitism. We are simply asking that they recognize their moral obligation to avoid giving aid and comfort to anti-Jewish racists. To UK news editors were saying the following: if you take seriously concerns expressed by the overwhelming majority of British Jews who believe, as Judy said, that their coverage fuels anti-Semitism, then we're asking them to please resist the urge to employ tropes and imagery which amplify Judeo-phobic narratives. We're asking them, finally, at the end of the day, to be diligent to guard against unwittingly becoming intellectual partners with anti-Semites. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Adam. That was sobering, for sure. And Adam, you deserve a tremendous amount of credit, together with your staff and your volunteers, for raising this issue to such a level. And now we're going to hear from Professor Robert Wistrich about more of the historical background of this. Professor Robert S. Wistrich was educated at Cambridge University, received his PhD from University College London in 1974. Since 1982, Professor Wistrich has been a tenured professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. In 1989, he was appointed to the Neuberger Chair of Modern European and Jewish History. Between 1991 and 1995, he was the first holder of the Jewish Chronicle Chair in Jewish Studies at University College London, while continuing to teach at Hebrew U. Since 2002, in addition to his teaching in the history departments we just mentioned, he has also headed the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism at Hebrew U here on Mount Scopus. Professor Wistrich has edited several journals, which I won't go into because they're voluminous, and I won't mention all the books and all the articles that he's the author of, other than to say that his recent magnum opus, A Lethal Obsession, Anti-Semitism from Antiquity to the Global Jihad, was really hailed by many, many people and commentators as the definitive work on the subject for our generation, certainly. His newest book is entitled From Ambivalence to Betrayal, The Left, the Jews, and Israel. And it too has received outstanding reviews. In 2013, the Allgemeine newspaper in New York selected him as one of the 100 most influential people in the Jewish world. And I want to welcome Professor Robert Wistrich to provide his remarks today. And we'll be talking, I think, about a reflection on Israel in the British media, exploring the causes and consequences of the hostile presentation of Israel in most of the British media for the past 30 or 40 years, with a special emphasis on questions relating to Palestine, terrorism, and the nature of the Jewish state. Professor Wistrich.
I regret that for unforeseen reasons I wasn't able to hear the first part of this evening, but I did come in time to see some of the familiar culprits in the present day wave of anti-Zionism, anti-Israel hatred, demonization of the Jewish state, and indeed anti-Semitism that is, I regret to say, all too familiar to one like myself, who grew up in Great Britain, who went to school there, to university, and left, thankfully, in 1982, so that I've been able to view much of what I assume has been said thus far with a certain detachment. And that is a relief, because I find, as a student of anti-Semitism, that the British variety, which does have some special characteristics, is a peculiarly unpleasant one. I would not have said this 20 years ago. At that time, I went back to Britain for a couple of years, holding a position at University College London simultaneously with my responsibilities at the Hebrew University. And in retrospect, that was probably the best time in the post-war era, or one of the best times, to be in Britain and in some way to be representing Israel. But it was a fleeting episode. Had I been asked at that time, where would Britain stand 20 years later in the league table of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel feeling in Europe, I would not have assumed it would be as high as it stands today. And for those of you who just want a statistical confirmation, we had it very recently when the Community Security Trust, CST, released the figures for 2014 of anti-Semitic incidents in the UK, and the number was above 1,000, which was the all-time record since they began registering these things. And they do that in a very, I would say, meticulous way. The British statistics on anti-Semitism only accept very well-documented cases. And you have to take into account of these 1,000 plus incidents in 2014, they are always, in every country, underreported. In other words, the real number of incidents was far higher. And that explains to a large degree why we've had in recent months increasing reports from Great Britain of the number of Anglo-Jews not known for being panicky by any, in any shape or form, discussing whether they have a future in Great Britain. That is something relatively new. I don't recall any such discussions in the past among Anglo-Jews. And although the situation is not comparable for the time being to France, in other words, we haven't seen a great spike in the Aliyah figures. They have risen, but they've risen moderately. There's no doubt that something has changed. Since the summer of 2014, I believe, nothing will quite be what it was before, even in Great Britain. Now, one remark that always struck me with regard to the peculiarity of British anti-Semitism, which was addressed in a very long book by a colleague, a friend of mine of sorts, Anthony Julius, well-known lawyer, literary critic, and student of anti-Semitism. He noted, and I think that's based on a similar personal experience to my own, that in Britain, anti-Semitism tends to take the form of the insidious slur, the deprecating insult, the rather condescending and slighting remark. Very stereotypical usually, and nevertheless taken for granted, and often expressed in a way that suggests that the person that does it is perhaps not even aware of what they're doing, although you can never be sure about that. And I think that somewhat extends to the problem we have in analyzing the British media. Because no media anywhere in the world operate in a vacuum. The question remains, and it's very hard to answer, does the British media or any of the rest of the Western media, when it comes to Israel and how they portray and represent it, does it reflect popular attitudes or what is imagined to be popular attitudes, or does it rather shape them? Does it create the agenda, or does it reflect an agenda that's created elsewhere? At the popular level, I have to say, and this is a feeling that's grown over the years, and not just based on conversations with taxi drivers from Heathrow Airport, I do feel that there is a growing gap between what your average man in the street in Great Britain might feel about Israel if pressed, to the extent they have any thoughts or feelings, and what we see reported and the commentaries which have been alluded to, particularly in the mainstream British press and the so-called quality press. I would certainly dispute its quality when we look at some of the examples in the treatment of Israel. But what is this gap? I don't honestly believe that the average Briton, and for the moment I'm putting, for the moment, Muslims aside, because that is a special case, and I'll come to it, that the average Briton shares the kind of assumptions that seem to prevail in the so-called thinking person's media, or in the BBC. But they are influenced by it nonetheless, because the pictures, the images that are shown, perhaps even more than the words, create an agenda. Many years ago, back in 1933, when Hitler came to power, a well-known British politician, a diplomat, and a literateur called Harold Nicholson made a remark that I've never forgotten, because I thought it captured something about the duplicity of the British in these matters. He said, "I loathe anti-Semitism, but I do dislike Jews." To which I'm tempted to reply, I loathe British anti-Semitism, and I really dislike the British more and more. And I say this as somebody who owes quite a lot, which I'm more than willing to recognize, to British education as it once was, but no longer is. And I think Nicholson captured something. Another commentator on that, and Julius brings this out in his book, remarked that British anti-Semitism is really anti-Semitism with the boots off. That's the big difference between Britain and Germany. Particularly in the 30s, that was obvious. You had the Nazi jackboots. And so a man like Nicholson, who really disliked Jews in a kind of aristocratic, condescending way, could be horrified by these SA thugs going around beating up Jews, because that's the kind of thing that's just not done. And in Britain it's always been very important what is done and what is not done. I think that bearing that in mind, we should look again at one of the most malevolent of the parallels that is consistently drawn in British media to this day regarding Israel. And that is basically the Nazi parallel. That we here in Israel, we Jews in Israel, behave and conduct ourselves, particularly towards the Palestinians, as the Nazis conducted themselves towards the Jews. This is a much beloved parallel among certain sections of the British media. Of course, it's not exclusive to Britain. This has now become a global disease. When certain detailed studies were made, in Germany in particular, only a couple of years ago, about Europeans, at least 9 European countries were investigated to see how this parallel actually works in surveys. And the results were astounding and shocking. Britain was not the worst offender, but it was well up there. Close to 40% of Britons thought it's true to say that the Israelis treat the Palestinians like the Nazis treated the Jews. There were some countries where it was even worse. Poland, despite the good bilateral relations between Poland and Israel, it was over 50%. Hungary was high. Germany was higher than Britain. Nevertheless, close to 40% of Britons thought that. Now, the origins of that actually go back a long way. And here is a point I think we must bear in mind, even if the British media rarely address it. And that is the obvious fact that Britain held the Palestine Mandate. And even if the present generation and those in the media today who call the tune and the politicians don't feel any obligation to that, don't necessarily recall the history of that mandate, it left, I think, a deep mark. And in my own research, I discovered that the Nazi-Zionist parallel was actually a British invention. I used to think when I first embarked on my studies, in the 1970s, I began my own research as a student. And I began with the Soviet Union because I knew Russian, and it happened to be the first job I was given as a researcher to read the Russian-Soviet press. And of course, in the 1970s, the Nazi-Zionist parallel was rampant all over the Soviet media. It was a state-controlled totalitarian device, very consciously used in domestic and foreign policy by the USSR and all its satellites. Just as the apartheid state was a Soviet construct of the 1970s. And many other things. Zionism is racism before it got to the United Nations. But the British preceded the Soviets in the 1940s in their war against Zionism, and that's what it was. Let's not forget this. From 1939 onwards, from the time of the British White Paper, despite World War II, and despite the famous saying of Ben-Gurion, you know, that the Yishuv will conduct itself as if there is no white paper and it will fight on Britain's side. But at the same time, it will oppose the white paper as if there was no war going on. But the British, from their angle, they saw the Zionists as a real threat. And they conducted a very harsh policy. They kept the gates of Palestine slammed shut throughout the war years, during the years of the Nazi Inferno, to make sure that not a single Jew would escape from Nazi-controlled Europe, if possible. They couldn't completely seal it off, but they did their damn best. And during that time, there was a propaganda war that Britain fought. And part of that war, and you look at the documents that are available, and it goes from the top down, from the British Colonial Office, the British Foreign Office, the colonial administration in Palestine, the British administration, the people in charge here, the British Army. They branded the Zionist movement as a Nazi movement. They compared the youth movements in this country with the Hitler Youth. And these parallels, which were utterly baseless, but nevertheless, whether they were believed or not, I can't tell you. But in the documents, they show up all the time. And later in the 1950s, and then in the 60s, when I was a student at Cambridge, and I remember reading for the first time a study of history by Arnold Toynbee, who was considered a great British scholar of history, philosopher of history. He was extremely popular at that time. And there are these appalling chapters in Toynbee's work about Zionism and the establishment of Israel, in which he calls the establishment of Israel the greatest crime against humanity, one that even is worse in his eyes than the monstrous Nazi crimes of World War II. And Arnold Toynbee was no leftist. This kind of thinking was taken over by whole swathes of the left, primarily after 1967. And of course it's never gone away. The Trotskyists, the communists, the anarchists, the anti-globalists, all the myriad different sects that flourished on the left of the spectrum. But it's not confined to the left. And today there are plenty of liberals and so-called enlightened intellectuals and conservatives too. And in Britain, they love this parallel. Sometimes people try to explain this in other European contexts by saying this is an attempt to project the latent guilt that Europeans feel for the Holocaust onto Israel, because this is a way of shifting the burden by saying, oh, you Israeli Jews, you're no better than us. In fact, you're even worse, because you didn't learn the lessons of history that we, supposedly, we Europeans, have learned. That's quite common. If a German or a French person takes that line, you might conceivably suspect there could be an element of that. But the British have a good conscience about World War II. It was their finest hour. In fact, they're always looking back with nostalgia, not just to the empire, but to that finest hour when they stood alone, which is true. They did. They had a heroic moment, particularly in 1940. And yet, that coincided with what, in retrospect, and not just from a Jewish point of view, must be seen as an astonishingly inhuman policy that they adopted through those years, and which continued right through to the establishment of Israel in 1948. Britain tried to abort that. And what is often forgotten and never mentioned in the British media is in 1947 there were actually some mini pogroms in the UK itself, quite apart from the rampant anti-Semitism that was present in the British Army when it was repressing the Jewish underground and fight for independence in those years. Some of you may remember the Commander-in-Chief of British forces in Palestine in 1946, Evelyn Barker, Lieutenant General Evelyn Barker, who ordered British forces in Tel Aviv and in all other areas of Jewish settlement not to fraternize, not to have any contact with the Jews, because we want to hit them in their pockets where it upsets them most. This race, he talked about the Jews as a race that were unworthy of, even unworthy of the mandate. Well, that is background. Today, there was a big shift that has gone steadily forward in the last 30, 35 years, whereby anti-Zionism became increasingly the province of the left, not just the far left, the intellectuals, the academics, to some extent even the Anglican Church has been infected, and many other groupings, I would say, of the more elite opinion-forming groups in Britain, who regard Israel increasingly, not just as was said here, and rightly and shockingly, of course, a nation of child murderers, an army of child murderers, but actually as a criminal entity, as a permanent, systematic violator of international law, of human rights, as an exemplar of racism itself. I have to tell you, as someone who grew up in Britain, I consider even the worst racists in this country, and I've met quite a few, and they certainly exist, and they need to be fought. But I've never experienced anything close to British racism, which is, I would say, 100 times more palpable, particularly when you scratch the surface. And when you look at the historical record, and particularly of the British Empire. So that these lessons of morality, which Britain, like the Scandinavian nations, is renowned for, you know, these outbursts of moral indignation about a country like Israel. I think we should step back a little and look more closely at those who are expressing this kind of superior, higher moral ground of judgment. You know, even when you look just at the record of Palestine, the way that the British crushed and repressed the Palestinians, the Palestinian Arabs, because there were Jewish Palestinians then as well, in between 1936 and 1939, particularly in the last 2 years of the great Arab revolt. Nothing that Sahel has ever done even remotely comes close to that. The way they sent in the RAF to strafe whole Arab villages, the way they hung all the leaders of the revolt. And they did this in many places. This is never addressed. What's addressed is the betrayal by Britain, supposedly, of the Arabs. Not the fact that they betrayed the Jews in 1939, but that the Balfour Declaration was this original sin which now has to be purged. And one of the ways of purging it is this relentless, non-stop, moralistic, and I think very two-faced kind of commentary that we get from the so-called quality press. Having said all that, I think it's important, since I have 5 minutes, to stress, and this is a ray of light, if you like, in that particular British gloom. At the present time, and actually for a number of years now, fortunately for Anglo-Jews, the people who actually run Britain, and well, particularly the prime ministers of Britain, the last three, have been as philo-Semitic and philo-Zionist as you can be in British terms. In other words, I'm referring to Mr. Tony Blair, his successor Gordon Brown, and the present incumbent, David Cameron. That doesn't mean their record is spot clean, but we can't judge them by purely Zionist criteria. In relative terms, it's hard to think of prime ministers who were more sympathetic in a hostile climate. Yes, Mrs. Thatcher was the first, certainly the first conservative leader to introduce a large number of Jews into her cabinet. She was instinctively quite sympathetic to Zionism, but nevertheless was restrained by the Foreign Office. Winston Churchill is remembered as a great Zionist, but he kept the white paper throughout the wartime years. Let's remember that too. And of course we go back to Lloyd George, Balfour, and that whole tradition, which was impressive, in some ways unique, except for the United States. There was no other country that had such a philo-Zionist tradition initially. But we see with Cameron and his predecessors that despite this very hostile climate, which I think has nurtured and encouraged and fostered anti-Semitism in Britain, that those people at the top, for various reasons, have not been unduly influenced by it. My last remarks pertain to the changing demography of Britain as of Europe. Today, there are approximately 3.3 million Muslims living in Britain out of a population of 63 million. The Jewish population is down to about 250,000. So the Jews are 0.4% of the British population. The Muslims are 5.4%, but rising. All the projections show in the younger age groups where we will be 15, 20, 30 years' time. Already the most popular boy's name in Great Britain is Mohammed. What is going to happen, particularly regarding the Jews, I won't talk about what will happen to British society, although they are becoming increasingly concerned, as are other Europeans. But for the Jews, so far, I'm not saying this is Gzerat HaGoral, but so far the news has not been particularly bright. The prospect, as in other European countries, is that even if you have only a small minority of jihadi-influenced, young, alienated radicals from the Muslim community, they can completely undermine the security, the stability, and the future of the Jewish community in Britain. It certainly could happen. I think it's well understood today that this is a rather dire prospect. Nobody quite knows how this might be resolved. There is interfaith dialogue. It's sporadic. It's not very influential. There are some attempts to bridge the gap. There are here and there some common interests. Nevertheless, it's a grave problem, and one that has aggravated the latent and the more overt anti-Semitism of the majority society, because it entered politics. Today, you have a factor that never existed before, that politicians in Britain, as in other European countries, take into account their sense that their Muslim electorate will appreciate a strong anti-Israel position, and this is factored in very often to the statements that they are willing to make. And that is a new factor that didn't previously exist. So overall, we can say Britain, the mother of parliaments, land of liberal toleration, freedom of speech, and many other virtues, democracy, has become a very problematic homeland, even for the Jews. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wistrich, for that very erudite analysis of both ends of the spectrum, the elite and the Muslim, and we'll get into that in the question and answer, I think. So now, more about the specifics, about the all-party parliamentary inquiry into anti-Semitism, which mentioned the BBC as having a role, and I'm quoting here, in whipping up anger through emotive content in the news and analysis that was broadcast. That is fairly damning for an all-parliamentary group. And of course, we all know that the BBC is the largest purveyor of media in the world, and that's why it should be of concern. So Hadar Sella, our next speaker, is the managing editor of BBC Watch. She was born in the north of England and has lived in Israel for more than 3 decades. Hadar has a special interest in the influence of the media on the British public's perception of the Middle East and the Islamist networks operating in the UK. And she has written several preemptive reports on several anti-Israel campaigns, including the flotillas, the Turkish flotillas, and the Global March to Jerusalem in March 2012. Hadar joined CIF Watch shortly after its establishment in 2009, and her work has been widely published. So please welcome Hadar.
Okay, the BBC. Of course, most people familiar with the BBC might perhaps not think of it as one of the factors contributing to anti-Semitism, and I'm sure its management and employees would be absolutely horrified at the thought. But the BBC, actually, the very respected BBC, does play a role in promoting specific views of Israel and even in mainstreaming anti-Semitic discourse into the public sphere, as we shall see in the coming minutes. That, of course, is all the more pernicious precisely because of the fact that the BBC is respected, mainstream, and even staid. We don't call it anti for nothing. Anti-Semitism, as we've been hearing already, has, of course, been brought very sharply into focus in the last few weeks. But of course it didn't begin in Copenhagen, it didn't begin in Paris, and it didn't begin in Operation Protective Edge in July 2014. It goes long before that. These are just some of the conclusions from the CST report that's been mentioned a couple of times by previous speakers. As has already been said, 2014 was the worst year on record. Records began in 1984. Conflicts between Israel and terrorist organisations inevitably lead to a rising anti-Semitic incidents. We saw it in 2009 during Castled. In the 2012 operation, it was quite short, so a little bit less. There's another important factor, though, in that CST report, which is that even before Operation Protective Edge, in the first half of the year, there was already an upward trend of anti-Semitic incidents being shown. So we can't put all 2014 onto Operation Protective Edge. So when we look at BBC coverage, we have to actually look at two things. Coverage of periods of intense conflict and periods outside the conflict to see how the BBC responds and acts in both those situations. Oh, I've gone the wrong way. Okay, now this is from the CST's report. I'm going to use this as an example because it's a very good example. They actually managed to record incidents on certain specific days when something specific happened and was reported by the media. So the part that I bolded here, on July 28th, a day when the media reported an explosion in Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza, the CST recorded 22 anti-Semitic incidents on that particular day in the UK. And the little window in the bottom right-hand corner is also from the CST report. That's one of the incidents they've reported. The guy says, "Hi Yids, just watching the BBC News." About this incident in the Shifa hospital. So first of all, what actually did happen there? So what happened was that around 5 o'clock in the afternoon on that particular day, the July 28th, an explosion took place at Shifa Hospital, and another one also in the Shati area of Gaza City about half an hour later. About half an hour later it was reported that around 10 people had been killed, including 8 children. Hamas immediately blamed Israeli airstrikes. Just about an hour later, just after 1800 hours, 6 o'clock, the IDF stated it had not been operating in that area and confirmed that both explosions were in fact missiles fired by terrorists. Not long afterwards, the IDF put out an aerial photograph which showed the trajectory paths of 4 missiles fired by terrorists in the Gaza Strip, as recorded by IDF radars and sensors. One of those missiles exploded near Shifa Hospital, another in Shati, a third in the sea, and the 4 was intercepted by the Iron Dome missile defence system. So an hour after the event, the journalists had the information. What did the BBC report? It reported the equivocal, both sides of the story. It is unclear. Hamas says. It didn't tell people what had happened. It told a story and it told another version. You see from the tweet in the bottom right hand corner, this is BBC breaking news. There's no doubt at all. It's telling people that Israel has killed these children. Later on in the same evening, the facts had been known for 7 hours. The BBC produced, a BBC reporter called Ian Pannell produced a very, very emotive report. It's all about the blood of children. He manages to mix in the very important Eid al-Fitr, end of Ramadan holiday into the whole story as well. And as you can see, it's an absolutely heart-rending story. 2 little boys killed, and again, people are not told how these children were killed. Children pay a heavy price in Gaza. Several days later, 31st of July, this was what, 3-4 days after the incident, the BBC put up, this is still on the website, all this stuff is still on the BBC website, put up a special article called Gaza Conflict Disputed Deadly Incidents. But we know it's not disputed. We already knew 3 days ago what happened. We knew that Palestinian rockets had killed these 8 children. Nevertheless, the BBC decided to call it Disputed Deadly Incidents. As I say, it stays there, it's on the website, and along with 2 or 3 other specific incidents. We have actually, I have contacted them about this. The IDF, the Military Attorney General, as I'm sure you know, has investigated numerous incidents, and this was one of them, and it's been shown unequivocally that Israel was not involved in the deaths of these children. I've contacted the BBC. The website still has that report on it. The CST again notes the theme that Adam was talking about, the theme of child murderers or baby killers. This tweet below is a BBC cameraman. He's called Adam Moose. Moose is his nickname, Campbell. Again, children of Gaza take the full brunt of Israeli attack. The whole issue of children is a very prominent one, and it's not the first time we've seen it, because we also saw it in 2012 during Operation Pillar of Defence. I don't know if you remember the story of Umar Masharawi, the son of a BBC employee from its Gaza office, who died on the first evening of Operation Pillar of Defence amidst some sort of explosive device hit the family home in Gaza City. The BBC immediately attributed the death of that baby to Israel. You can see this is the same evening. Paul Adams, BBC correspondent in Washington. Spare a thought for Omar, 11-month son of our BBC Arabic service colleague in Gaza, killed in today's Israeli airstrike. Now, there were plenty of reasons to be very, very suspicious about deciding it was an Israeli airstrike right at the time. And myself and several other bloggers made very big efforts to try to bring this to the attention of the press. The story went absolutely crazy. The BBC pushed it very, very hard. That article was one of the lead articles on the BBC website for over 4 months. Then, in March 2013, the UN put out a report and confirmed what we'd long suspected, that in fact it was another Palestinian misfired rocket that landed on that house, and that child hadn't been killed by an Israeli airstrike at all. Nevertheless, the story was already bigger than the facts. And so we see at a demonstration in London in April 2013, the picture of the BBC correspondent and his baby, 65 years of murder. Another demonstration below, June 2013. And on the left here we have a letters page from The Guardian from last summer, when the Guardian letters page used the same picture of the same incident, which, as we said, wasn't an Israeli incident, to describe Israel's attacks on Gaza. This is so etched, that picture is so etched in people's psyche already, that it doesn't matter how many facts and how much truth we bring, it's already there. Again, on the subject of, as this has also been mentioned, the all-party parliamentary inquiry, as I think Julie said, cited the BBC, said in particular the BBC had a role to play in whipping up anger through emotive content during Operation Protective Edge in the summer. The picture below is an interview with a British intellectual called Tariq Ali at a demonstration in London on August 9th. And as you can see, the entire, this is a screenshot from a video from the film, the entire interview was conducted with this guy standing behind saying, Israel are baby killers, stop them. The BBC didn't move the camera, the BBC didn't stop the interview. They just showed that guy throughout the whole interview. Eric Pickles, the Secretary of State for Communities, recently made the statement here about ordinary people turning a blind eye to anti-Semitism. The BBC put a lot of effort into covering the various demonstrations against Israel in the summer in the UK. All these pictures here were taken at demonstrations in the UK. BBC audiences never saw those pictures, never saw any evidence of the anti-Semitism at the anti-Israel demonstrations in the UK last summer. Didn't exist as far as the BBC was concerned. Now, if we look at what happens outside periods of conflict, we see that the BBC amplifies a whole variety of tropes, some to do with Israel, some to do with Jews. One of the things we see a lot, and it's actually growing, is the whole amplification of the apartheid trope. So we have sort of direct amplification where people accuse Israel of apartheid. The Ahmed Katadra is a South African anti-apartheid activist, and so of course he has even more weight when it comes to accusing Israel of apartheid. And then we get all sorts of indirect reports as well, where you have Saib Arakat, or sometimes it's Hanan Ashrawi, or Mustafa Barghouti is a great favourite, accusing Israel of apartheid. The trouble is that the BBC never explains to its audiences why that's not true. And so it's just allowed to stand, and it becomes part of the common conversation in the UK. And it's not just the Palestine Solidarity Campaign that's saying that Israel is an apartheid state. The BBC says it, so it must be true. And that's the sort of thing that we are facing. Another very popular theme is BDS, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement. It's getting worse. It's been particularly bad since this time last year, where there was the whole SodaStream Scarlett Johansson story, if you remember, with Oxfam. It's getting worse and worse. The BBC promotes BDS, particularly its Middle East editor, Jeremy Boyne. It never, ever explains to people what the BDS movement is, what its aims are, what it's all about, how it's about a one-state solution, how it actually seeks to eradicate Israel. So again, BDS becomes part of the normal conversation in the British public. With relation to Jews rather than Israel, the Jewish lobby trope. This is something you see an awful lot on the BBC. It's quite amazing that in the 21st century we have BBC guests and presenters and staff who are promoting the Jewish lobby trope as if it's quite as if there's nothing to do with it. But so we have several examples here, more older examples, and some new examples. The top one is a guy who he actually doesn't work for the BBC, but he was brought in to do a papers review. The BBC presenter sitting next to him didn't bat an eyelid when he said, now we all know that how influential AIPAC is, a role model for lobbying and taking control of a foreign government, effectively. The part below, the section below, refers to Ed Miliband, the leader in British politics, leader of the British Labour Party, and of course he's Jewish, and there's been a lot of talk about him lately because of the elections in the UK. But again, you see that there's a conversation going on here in which the existence of a Jewish lobby is accepted and part of the normal conversation. Nobody's raising any sort of eyebrows. The top part especially, again, this is about Ed Miliband. He ate a bacon sandwich, very unelegantly. But look at the last sentence here. The last sentence is, it's about the Jewish. It might offend the more powerful lobby, the Israeli lobby, which already has Big Brother America kowtowing to its every wish. I mean, it really is unacceptable. It's kind of un-British, anyway. Now look at that, un-British. The All-Party Report takes note of the subject of the Jewish lobby as well. Unfortunately, the BBC didn't seem to read it. When we do see anti-Semitism in Britain, it's very interesting to see how the BBC reports it. We had last year, look, 2 years ago actually, the MP for Bradford East, David Ward, who actually made an anti-Semitic comment. It was reported in the BBC as an Israel comment. It wasn't. It was an anti-Semitic comment. He accused Jews of behaving like the Holocaust. Lord Ahmed, a peer in the UK, again, he made anti-Semitic claims. The BBC described it as Jewish claims, not calling anti-Semitism what it is. One very, very recent example, which I'm sure a lot of you will have heard of, is during the recent march on the 11th of January in Paris, after the attacks on the Charlie Hebdo and the Coach supermarket, a BBC staffer called Tim Wilcox interviewed a lady who's actually Israeli but lives in France, and she was with the young man beside her who's Muslim of Algerian origin, and the lady, she's called Chava. She said the situation is going back to the days of the 1930s in Europe, and he said the bottom line is he suggests that the Jews in Europe are responsible for what happens here in the Middle East. Now that's clearly anti-Semitic. That, according to the EUMC definition of anti-Semitism, that's clearly an anti-Semitic statement. The BBC, however, it's gone through a whole process. There were loads of complaints. It's gone through a whole process of the BBC complaint system. At the moment, we're at the ECU stage, the Editorial Complaints Unit. The head of the ECU doesn't think it's anti-Semitic, and he obviously thinks that he's the guy who can decide as well what's anti-Semitic and what isn't. One very, very serious problem is that of BBC discussion forums. If it's comments on articles, if it's BBC, official BBC Facebook pages, part of the BBC's mandate, we can call it, its remit, is to promote discussion. And so it does it by allowing comments on articles, by opening Facebook accounts. There's a lot of anti-Semitism on these accounts. It's quite hard to monitor them all, but there is a lot of anti-Semitism which goes unmonitored, which goes unnoticed, and it's left there and mainstreams anti-Semitic discussion, anti-Semitic discourse in British and in fact world society, because all these things are on the internet, they're available to anybody at all. Thank you.
Thanks, Hadar. So much for the BBC. What about the Jewish responses to this UK media bias? So for that, we are going to turn to Lucille Cohen, a veteran Israeli pro-Israel activist. Lucille has been the president of the Zionist Central Council of Greater Manchester and of the Jewish Representative Council of Greater Manchester and Region. She was also the chairman of the annual Yom Ha'atzmaut celebrations, represented Greater Manchester on both the Board of Deputies and the Jewish Leadership Council. She has worked for the Jewish Chronicle and the Jewish Gazette in the UK. Lucille has a master's degree in Middle East Studies and worked in a previous cadencia here on the Jerusalem Post and as acting editor of a very eclectic tourism fortnightly called The Holy Land. She has taught for 10 years at Manchester University and has been an honorary research fellow there for many years. Subsequent to making Aliyah last March, she was appointed to the editorial board of Esther magazine and has been teaching and coordinating a young ambassadors course for teenagers at a high school in Zichron Yaakov, where she and her husband now live. Please welcome Lucille Cohen.
Thank you. I think it's true to say that for the first time in my lifetime, the Jewish community in Britain is feeling decidedly uncomfortable. Some of us there, who are still there, are keeping a low profile. Some are angry. Some are even fighting back. And some are escaping either to Israel or to the United States. I'm sure that all of you here today will agree with me that there was a time, perhaps from the end of the Second World War and its emergent revelations of the brutal nature of the indelible scar left by the Holocaust, when Jew baiting had become such a taboo that it was rare to hear, see or read anything tantamount to overt anti-Semitism. And regarding anti-Zionism, well, if you asked the man on the proverbial Clapham omnibus what Zionism was, he might have been hard-pressed to tell you. But Israel he did know about. He'd seen those giants of the screen, Paul Newman in Exodus, and Kirk Douglas in that wonderful film Cast a Giant Shadow, not forgetting Charlton Heston in all those biblical epics, all looking the very embodiment of the noble Hebrew. Those images, taken together, swiftly followed by the 6 Days' War, often termed plucky little Israel, as a David prevailing over the Goliath of the surrounding Arab states out to destroy us, fixed Israel and the Jewish people in the cast of the much admired and strong new Jew, the Sabra, a hero, a model to be emulated. And not only that, but the reborn Israel, the state inhabited by its own people Israel, was the legendary phoenix risen from the ashes, the biblical shriveled seed sprouting out of the dry earth, the ingathering of the exiles as prophesied. So what went wrong? How did that hero of the 60s become the vilified Jew, the sneered at Zionist of the 21st century? How on earth did our beloved cause Zionism become a dirty word? How has the Jewish community reacted to finding itself and its well-beloved cast yet again as the world's baddie of history? Time and again, those who have been active in the community have pointed the finger at the media. The media is a promulgator of the worst excesses of anti-Israel prejudice and bias. The communal organisations such as the Zionist Federation, ably represented here tonight by Andrew Bolcom, past president, the Board of Deputies, the Zionist Central Council of Greater Manchester, and the Jewish Representative Council, coupled with networks for Hasbara, or Israel advocacy as some prefer to call it, have been crying foul for many a year. The UK media, particularly the BBC, The Guardian and The Independent, was soon earmarked as the main culprit, spreading not only biased news reports, but also opinion masquerading as fact about Israel. In response, the ZF and the ZCC have run regular media response seminar series for many years. They've run political lobbying days in the Houses of Parliament. They've joined our Christian Friends groups into the struggle. I know. I've been involved as president of the Manchester ZCC in association with the ZF. I know how ardently we've worked. And I know that both the Board of Deputies and the Jewish Leadership Council have also put in quite a bit of work. However, in all the past 15 years, from approximately shortly after the millennium, when the second Intifada started, until this past summer, it has been extremely difficult to mobilise the British Jewish community. The vast majority just carried on, led their own lives, perhaps attended shul, and were extremely difficult to get fired up about Israel, apart from the stalwart core of, let's guess, perhaps 3%. That same core of stalwarts would turn up regularly at talks and seminars, but elsewhere, apathy seemed to reign supreme. But as president of the Representative Council, which represents about 250 organisations, we were involved in consultations 24/7 with such organisations and bodies as the media, government, politicians, local authorities, interfaith organisations, universities, NGOs, etc., etc., etc. And I obtained a sort of satellite bird's eye type view, which afforded me one of the unique perspectives, one of the unique overviews, so that I could zoom in on any sphere of anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic activity and take the pulse of the wider community, as it were. And that pulse indicated a sick patient, one that was becoming sicker by the day. That sickness I readily identified as a new virulent form of a mutated anti-Semitism, as we've heard, carried by a new pathogen, anti-Zionism, and its main vector was the media. Believe me, I too felt sickened at this rapidly spreading recurrent disease. It was like fighting an ongoing war for all of us, and still is. Some battles may have been won, but the war of public opinion was being, and is being, gradually lost. And it was plain to see. Attacks have come from all quarters. Those who did support us must have been astounded by the gratitude that this engendered on each occasion from the Jewish community. While president, we had trouble, and we still do, with the Quakers, the Methodists, even the Church of England regarding Israel and boycotts. Thankfully, the anti-Zionist Reverend Stephen Sizer has had his claws well and truly clipped in this past month. In April 2012, we saw Israel's deputy ambassador threatened by a mob at Manchester University, and we had to deal with the police and the university authorities on that. You see the deputy ambassador on the left, Talia Lador-Fresher, and on the right you'll see the vice-chancellor and president of Manchester University, Dame Professor Nancy Rothwell, and this is the ambassador's car being rocked by protesters outside. The police claim they didn't have the right to go on the premises, was on this approach road, because it was private property. So the staff you'll see are just university security staff, unarmed. So we had to deal with the police and the university and all the various authorities on trying to get that stuff. And to her credit, Dame Nancy did put in as robust a policy as she possibly could across the university. But that's not echoed by all university vice-chancellors by any means. When I'd step off the plane, for example, coming back from, e.g. Israel, I'd turn on my mobile in the luggage collection, and there'd be a phone call from the head of the CST. For example, there is a giant swastika, Lucille, tonight, daubed on the 10-foot wall outside the Bishop of Manchester's residence on the main arterial road, the A56 going to Manchester. We'll probably be able to get it wiped off when we get permission from the council tomorrow. What say I? Don't wait for the council, get it wiped off tonight. We don't want it seen. And they did, to their credit, and they did with many other daubings and damages to cemeteries. We've had to struggle with the health authority to soften and remove prejudice from pamphlets about circumcision. We've mobilised the Jewish community nationally to campaign on behalf of Shechita in the EU, and this is going on in Britain now. The list was endless. You may have heard of Ronnie Fraser. He brought a court case against the University and College Union based on charges of anti-Semitism for its intimidating atmosphere of anti-Zionism. The Representative Council put him in touch with a source of funding to secure the services of the famous top-notch law firm Mishkon Dereya. But all to no avail, because the judge didn't perhaps agree with the EU's definition of anti-Semitism. The Representative Council found itself dealing with the Manchester Mental Health Trust when it cancelled Israeli conflict resolution specialist and former Israel negotiating team member Moti Crystal, Professor Moti Crystal, who had, ironically, been scheduled to provide workshops between the union and the health authority to deal with disputes arising. His JLC-sponsored court case, in which he considered suing Unison, the union was already the union was already boycotting Israeli goods from the territories. They were objecting to his workshops, to an Israeli holding these workshops, and the Health Trust decided that they would cancel Monte Crystal. So Monte Crystal decided he was going to sue them for racial discrimination, because the Health Trust has no right to discriminate on these grounds. But it culminated with his dropping the case in May 24 in return for an apology from the Trust, which appeared to be possibly the best we could get. But by far the greatest cause for concern and spur for most of the community's externally sourced problems was the ever-growing conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, fueled by the media. Ever since I was a student in the 70s, the Zionism equals racism resolution at the UN had led to university union policies at many universities of no platform for racists. The Socialist Workers' Party and Palestinian societies would then try to pass motions equating Zionism with racism, and this was a means to prevent any manifestation of Zionism by Jewish societies at these universities. And to a certain extent they've been successful. Most Jewish societies and the Union of Jewish Students have been putting out an at best ambivalent message about Israel, or at worst just ignoring the issue and retreating into a sort of shtetl mentality. This is Monte Crystal. That was the resolution adopted by the UN. This is the Union of Manchester Mental Health Authority. The equating of Zionism with racism was, in my opinion, when the rot set in. Those graduates became the leading journalists and reporters in the left-leading media. It affected would-be politicians and soon-to-be church leaders, and affected incipient union activists and heads. It affected the co-op. A similar process is taking place on American campuses today, and one wonders what exactly will happen in the next generation in the United States. So, in many leading local and national institutions, the media's bias finds resonance with its leaders. Thank goodness the current government is still standing firmly behind Israel and the Jewish community. The majority of the Jewish community is more comfortable with the thought of an Israel-supporting Gentile who supports Shechita and Brit Milah as the next Prime Minister than a Jew who is currently leader of the opposition, who has been mentioned already. If the next British government adopts anti-Israel policies, and it could well do so, then the bell may well be tolling for Britain's Jewish community. So what's woken up the Jewish community? There have been signs and precursors of a growing activism. Manchester held a big National Israel Advocacy Conference in 2011. You'll see on the right of the screen, the big tent for Israel. Much controversy actually surrounded this event, but that's a totally different story. It was going to predate its London version, arranged by BICOM. But London asked us to hold off until after theirs. We attracted our maximum capacity of 750, and London attracted 1,500. These numbers indicate some sort of shift in perception. But the real shift came this summer, as we've all heard, in the fallout from the media reporting of Operation Protective Edge. It was so blatantly biased. Gazans were suffering, and Lord knows we don't want anyone to suffer. But for goodness sake, why don't they just leave us alone? What coverage did we get of the tens of thousands of rockets raining down on us? There was plenty, though, of the results of our responses. Demonisation of the Jew was having a field day. Delegitimization of Israel became the byword, and boycott, divestment and sanction rallying took on an ever greater momentum. As we've repeatedly heard, the CST recorded its highest number of incidents, more than 1,000 in 2014, the worst previous year being 931. Anyone visibly Jewish seemed to have become fair game. People started to feel nervous. Colleagues of Jewish people at work were openly voicing accusatory comments. Physical attacks were taking place, and some Muslims felt emboldened enough physically to defend their brothers in Gaza. Attacks, as we know, in Toulouse, Brussels, and now Paris and Copenhagen have made the community jittery. The CST has upped its security levels, and so has the government. Schools look like fortresses. Parents worry about their children coming home in Jewish school uniform. For example, a plan to model the Hail Eruv on those of other areas has met with outright vocal anti-Semitism at a local public meeting in South Manchester this past autumn. And amid this onslaught of the Jewish community, a spring to autumn demonstration last year against an Israeli-owned cosmetics shop, Kedem, in the middle of Manchester, by a ragtag band of anarchists, professional demonstrators, dole cadgers, and a few Muslims, resulted in counter demos by members of the Jewish community and their supporters. These demonstrations evolved into a vigorous grassroots proactive campaign group calling itself Northwest Friends of Israel. One of its founders, Rafi Bloom, says it came about through a combination of like-minded people coming together because of what they perceived as a lack of leadership. It has more than 3,000 members now on its Facebook site and has held rallies, vigils, Israeli buying produce days, and is involved in social media hasbara, and now have come to cooperate with many of the more mainstream organisations. In Brighton, Sussex Friends of Israel has become active, while in London, Gideon Falter and 7 more like-minded people, including Mandy Blumenthal and Jonathan Sacerdote, have melded on Facebook to form the campaign against anti-Semitism. Its catalyst was the anti-Semitic wave in August. It took off and held a rally, lobbies MPs with 80 volunteers. They also work with other organisations now. And they arranged surveys. The results for the British community found that 77% saw as anti-Semitic comments about Israel. 82% think that anti-Semitism is further fueled by the media. 25% considered leaving Britain, and 45% feared there was a long-term future. Gideon Falter thinks we're at a tipping point and we have to fight to keep and maintain our balance as a community. There's a lot about the all-party campaign against anti-Semitism. I'm not going to go into that now because it's been touched upon and I don't have the time left anyway. All these grassroots organisations were galvanised by the sense that they had to act. They felt that the established ones were not doing enough or not reacting swiftly enough, but the irony is that it could be argued that they are now becoming mainstream too. So some segments of the community have woken up. It's more aware. It's on the lookout for anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. A new generation has arisen to take on the mantle. In their minds, the wishy-washy nature of the support for Israel by the board, the JLC, and some rep councils in support of Israel is out, and anti-Semitism will no longer be tolerated. There is a sea change, but the media carries on regardless, relentlessly bashing Israel, so that public perception of Israel and the Jewish community continues to deteriorate. We are likely to see even more aliyah and even more emigration to the US. After the Israeli elections, more EU and American pressure on Israel is expected. Europe is becoming an increasingly hostile arena, but have no doubt the Jewish community is fighting back. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucille, Jewish activism at work. Now it's your turn. Any questions you have, please direct them to a particular speaker if you can, and please make them questions and not statements. We have kind of limited time. And this gentleman here, go ahead.
Despite your instruction, I am making a general question, but I'll make it a short general question. I'm reading that there is a growing movement in Great Britain against immigration partly under the banner of the EDP, but also other groups. How do you think, I understand they're getting 15% in the polls, that's significant. How do you think this will affect the Jews?
Who would like to tackle that question?
Should we stay here?
Yes, and use the microphone that's there, with the bottom, just the bottom button.
Okay. I would have said,
The bottom button. Yeah. Just,
okay, I would have said that immigration has become a major issue, much bigger one than you seem to suggest, particularly the rise of UKIP, which, as you know, won the European elections in Britain, was largely over two issues. One was that Britain must get out of Europe, but why must Britain leave Europe at all costs? In order to regain control of its borders, and that's directly related to immigration. It's a feeling that Britain is going to be swamped by foreigners, so this appeals to xenophobia, of course. Muslims are a big concern, but not the only concern when it comes to immigration. And how will this affect the Jews? I think that there's an instinctive reflex of Jews over a long period of time, because they themselves were immigrants to Britain, not to be enthused by parties or movements or trends that try and restrict immigration. But this may be modified today, because as I was suggesting towards the end of my own remarks, I think there's an increasing awareness among most British Jews, and that's reflected in surveys that I've seen, that the most dangerous single threat to their existence today is Islamist extremism. And they do relate that to immigration, even though, again, we're talking about a minority of Muslims, but an extremely dangerous one. So I think that's the way it impacts on Jews, and the multicultural nature of British society, which today is indisputable, and it's dramatically changed since when I went to university in that respect, has not proved to be such a great boon for Jews as perhaps some hoped it might be. Not that everything about multiculturalism is bad, but it actually is not working very well. And it's had some pretty dire effects for the Jewish community, even though not all aspects of it have worked to their disadvantage. So yeah, I think it's a worry, but it's secondary to the immediate issue that's been touched on, I think, probably by everyone here, which is safety. The Jews of Britain no longer feel safe. Full stop.
anybody else want to tackle that question?
I think there's a very confused attitude among the Jews of Britain as to what to do about the immigration debate, because as Professor Wistrich said, we were immigrants to Britain, and we tend to try and be tolerant. However, the government has dropped its flavour of the year, or several years, policy of multiculturalism, because it sees prevent became one of its main policies, which to prevent terrorism. And in doing this, they are also trying to prevent the immigration of mullahs who are taken into mosques and become radical Islamic preachers and great influences in these mosques. And naturally the EDL, English Defence League, does attract a certain number of supporters in Britain. You will always have that National Front. But UKIP has plumbed the concerns of people who just don't want to be part of Europe. And one of the worries that hasn't often been highlighted as being part of Europe is that there would be a Minister for Foreign Affairs. We already have a quasi-Minister for Foreign Affairs for Europe, for the EU. But to actually have a proper functioning
Foreign Affairs Ministry and Minister of Foreign Affairs in the EU would be likely to be extremely anti-Israel. And that's something that Jews in Britain are concerned about, one of the aspects. Okay.
Gentleman at the back.
I'm wondering if any of you have seen the BBC production of The Honorable Woman? If there was any backlash to this
There was at the time. There was quite a lot of backlash at the time. It was a drama, so it's a different sort of kettle of fish as far as criticism goes. You can criticise drama as being unfactual, but it is still drama. It's a different thing than criticising a news report. There was quite a few complaints made about it, but of course not a lot done about it. I just note it's actually now being broadcast in the States as well, in the US. It's gone on tour there as well.
Also in Israel.
Oh, also in Israel? Yeah. Oh.
Yeah, I wanted to ask her as well that do you ever get any response from the BBC about correcting things where they admit that they made a mistake?
Okay.
Yeah. Do they ever admit that there is a problem going on in the BBC, or is it always?
Okay, the short answer is no, and the long answer is no as well. They don't even acknowledge emails. I send them emails, they don't even bother replying, thank you for your email, we think it's a load of rubbish, nothing at all. They just ignore me. I actually rang them up one night, rang the night desk, and they made the mistake of thinking I was actually from the BBC, because I said, hello, I'm from the BBC. No, they do correct sometimes. They don't have a corrections page, so you can't tell if an article you read 3 days ago has actually been dramatically changed to correct something. You've no idea. You've either got to take it as it was then, or keep reading the same article time and time again until you notice if there's been a correction made. They sometimes add a footnote, but that's quite rare as well. So sometimes you can't even tell that something's been changed. They're really, really bad. I don't know if you've read the report that came out from the DCMS this last week from the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. Yeah. One of their big main conclusions in their recent inquiry into the future of the BBC is that the complaint system needs to be changed. The BBC can't be self-regulating anymore. So I really hope that will actually change. I think that's one of the major things that needs to happen.
In the back, one of the Chayalim or Chayalot.
So one of the examples that you brought up of the hospital is something that we actually dealt with was the IDA spokesperson. My question is, what is the extent of changes that you can do? Can you actually do any legal action as well? Because in some cases they're actually telling lies.
I can't do any legal action, but I mean, I imagine if Israel chose to do some sort of legal action, it could. So far, it's chosen not to. The BBC has a reputation which perhaps we're a little bit too forgiving about these days. I think that we've seen some particularly bad cases in the last few years. And there was an incident in the 2012 operation in Pillar of Defence, where the BBC's correspondent in Gaza, John Donison, tweeted a picture of a little girl who was injured, and wrote it was a retweet actually, he wrote underneath heartbreaking, and it was a heartbreaking picture, except it was from Syria, it wasn't from Gaza, and he was passing it off as being from Gaza. Now we made a whole big I saw it, wrote a post very quickly, it went viral. I got 46,000 page views in the first few hours. It went absolutely wild, and the government press office got involved in that. In the end, he was removed. He got moved to Australia. Did that particular?
That's what the British do.
Yes, that's what the British do with. Yes. So he's in Australia, yeah, I mean, we need to be proactive because people do, it does make a difference, and things can be changed. The BBC knows we're watching them, and it keeps them on their toes, and I'm very glad about it.
one thing that occurs to me when I'm listening to all the speakers, we're tiptoeing around, or you all did, and I'll throw it out to all of you, tiptoeing around the giant in the room. And that is the fact that most of this anti-Semitism is coming from the left, morphing into the slightly left. I mean, the New York Times, for example, I'm an American. The New York Times, Peter Baynard, a whole bunch of these people are in no way, shape, or form called to account. It's the right-wingers in the United States who are pro-Israel. It's the left that is anti-Israel, and nobody here seems to be willing to really stamp down on these guys. Could you? I throw it to everybody.
Yeah, actually, I dealt with that quite extensively in my own remarks. There's no real question about the fact that a great deal of the anti-Israel animus and resentment and hostility, not to say hysteria, which I think is an appropriate word, that we are witnessing comes primarily from the left and from many different sections. There was a time, if I go back 30 years, I would say it was more the far left. That was people that were considered fairly marginal, like the Trotskyists, or say the communist parties of that time. Today, it's much more fragmented left, but it's also almost all sections except for there is a moderate democratic left. In France, for instance, you see it more. It's in government, very protective of the Jewish community. Perhaps it's surprised some people how robust, how determined it has been to oppose anti-Semitism and to contain the worst forms of anti-Zionism. So it's not the entire left, but it's a very broad sector. And the worst of all, I have to say, from my perspective, the worst are the academics on one hand and the Jewish intellectuals on the other, who embrace this cause because they seem to have a personal stake in this vitriolic defamation, systematic defamation of the Jewish state, as if their whole identity, in a negative way, is premised on their negation of Israel.
Just want to quickly add the 2014 report by the Community Security Trust, which reported the highest rate of anti-Semitism since they've been keeping records in 1984, was very clear that when victims of anti-Semitism could identify their attackers or the perpetrator, that the perpetrator was overwhelmingly either a radical Muslim, a radical extremist, or a radical leftist, with a very small percentage being from the right. So I don't think there's anyone tiptoeing around that. I mean, certainly CST made that very clear. When we blog about it, we're very clear about who the perpetrators are. So I don't think we do tiptoe around it, at least insofar as reporting about the British media.
So we'll take two more questions over here. This gentleman over here.
So listen, tonight, briefly, there was touched about on the Church of England, which provides the immoral substrate for the country, which has a Union Jack with multiple crosses in it, and which is devoutly supersessionist. And not that it's a recently anti-Semitic, but I believe throughout its history has been anti-Semitic, together with its stepsisters, the Presbyterian Church and the Episcopalian Church in America. And what I didn't hear tonight is the depth and the extent that this substrate throughout the United Kingdom is influenced by the moral leadership, I call it immoral leadership, of the Church of England.
Well, I wouldn't go all the way with you on that. There have been other strands in the Anglican Church, and if you go back to the worst period of all, the late 1930s and World War II, actually the then Archbishop of Canterbury was one of the strongest voices in Britain for its opening its borders to Jews who were desperately seeking a refuge. He was very much opposed to the British government's position. He was one of the more humane voices. However, there's no question that the Anglican Church in recent 2 decades at least has gradually been moving to a kind of pro-BDS position, very much like some of the churches you mentioned in the United States. We see the Methodist Church adopting a statement a few years ago that could have been written by the Hamas almost, and other symptoms of the sickness, and a reference was made to the Reverend Sizer and this kind of, I would call it Palestinian liberation theology being internalized by the Church of England, which is a very worrying trend. There may be the beginnings of a bit of a corrective right now. I wouldn't count on it too much, but the fact, the way in which the Reverend Sizer was disciplined, that was a kind of surprise. It was a very strong backlash. We'll see if that's maybe a harbinger of some kind of growing awareness of where this is leading. And one other point about the Church of England, I think we shouldn't underestimate the danger. It's been there before in the past, that there could be a Christian-Muslim rapprochement at Jewish expense that passes through the issue of Palestine, Palestine being one of the keys to it. On the other hand, and against that, one of the problems Anglo-Jews face is they don't have any equivalent to what exists in the United States in terms of it's an evangelical Christian community that is strongly pro-Israel. I believe there are pockets of that have never been really tapped in Britain, but they seem to be very much a minority voice.
There's another factor that I haven't heard anybody relating to with regard to the BBC. About 15 or 20 years ago, when I was looking at the budget of the BBC out of curiosity, I noticed that about £100 million sterling came for the BBC World Service, came from the Foreign Office. And at that time, it represented about 20% of the budget. It was a highly significant figure. So that's one aspect. I think that continues, but they've discreetly taken that piece of information out of their, off the internet. You can't read that when you look at the BBC budget today. You can't glean that fact. But I think we need to keep another thing in mind. There are 1.2 billion Muslims out there. And as an arm of the Foreign Office, the BBC is there to speak to those Muslims more than it is to the 12 million Jews on this planet.
The funding's actually changed. The World Service doesn't get direct money from the Foreign Office anymore. It used to do until a year ago, April 2014. It stopped getting the money from the Foreign Office. There are still some indirect grants and things like that. There is money, but there is definitely a connection between the World Service and the Foreign Office. You can call it, I mean, it has been a financial connection, but it's also a spiritual connection. And I've actually been sort of amusing myself, strange hobbies, amusing myself by looking what's on the agenda in Parliament and what's on the BBC's agenda. So you'll notice, for instance, that when the vote whether or not to intervene in Syria after Assad was throwing barrel bombs and chemical weapons at the people in Syria, when that came up to Parliament, the BBC did a massive feature on that subject on the same day. And if you look, you can see a lot of correlation between Foreign Office and the way Foreign Office views things and the way the BBC presents things. There's no doubt about it. Yeah, we keep an eye on it. I keep an eye on it, but I think the World Service is very often a lot worse than domestic BBC. I'm not sure people in Britain sometimes realise how bad the World Service is in terms of its Israel coverage and in terms of its general coverage as well. It doesn't have the same rules and regulations. You know, the sort of the editorial guidelines for domestic content are different. But nevertheless, you can see a big difference between the two arms of the BBC. Okay.
I have a question for Adam. Middle Eastern anti-Semitism. Middle East is a giant region. It's curious to know about the gradations of difference between countries, between Muslim Arab nations and Muslim nations, between Shia. If you and your staff investigated these differences.
I haven't, but the Anti-Defamation League put out a report a few months ago on a really comprehensive global anti-Semitism report. And I forget the number of countries, maybe over 80 countries were surveyed. And not surprisingly, in the Muslim Middle East was the worst anti-Semitism. Now within the Muslim Middle East, it actually was quite consistent. I mean, it was over 90% in most of the countries in our region. The only exception actually in terms of Muslim majority countries that had lower rates of anti-Semitism was Iran, surprisingly. But within our region, for instance, the highest percentage was in the Palestinian territories. 93% had held anti-Semitic views, according to the ADL poll. In Egypt and Syria and Lebanon, there was almost, it was very close. It was like maybe 89 to 90%. So to answer your question, I mean, in our region, it's almost universal. It's over 90%. In Iran, it's a little lower. I don't recall the other Muslim countries in the survey, but the ADL has a fantastic poll you should check out online.
Just briefly to add to that, also the non-Arab Muslim countries, particularly Turkey, where the problem has become very intense in the last decade, partly as a result of the present government there and the Prime Minister and now President Erdogan, but also countries like Pakistan. You have a rabid anti-Semitism of almost incredible dimensions in a country where at best there might be 20 Jews out of our 175 million people.
So we'll take one last question and then I'm sure our panelists will be able to be around.
Thank you. There are two trends, I think, underway now in the world scene, and specifically for Professor Wistrich. I wonder if they're stationary or growing. One is very much pro-Israel, and that is seeing that attacks on Israel, verbal and otherwise, are really playing into a global agenda for world domination by evil regimes, whether it be the Ayatollahs in Iran or it be ISIS. Is there a growing comprehension that Israel, among certain influential people in the UK, that Israel really is the herald at the gate? And the competing trend that may also be growing is that Israel is in fact a threat to world peace, just like Czechoslovakia was in May 1938. By the way, you can Google May 1938. So how do you see these two trends having changed? Do you see them growing? Again, one, that Israel is recognized as a bulwark against radical extremism rather than a cause of radical extremism, and the other being that Israel is a threat to our very lives because it is threatening the peace of the world.
I think you have to make a distinction here along the lines of what I tried to suggest at the end of my talk. I think if you're talking about governments, and particularly about the military and the intelligence agencies in those governments, they do have a sense of what you were alluding to. For instance, the case of Britain, there's no doubt that there is very close intelligence cooperation at the highest level between Britain and Israel. Excellent relations, as close as they are between the US and Israel, probably in many areas. And there are good reasons for that, because people who work in that field, they appreciate Israeli expertise and experience. And there's a lot they know they can use and learn from. And there's a huge disconnect between that and the kind of things, all of which are true. Everything you heard tonight, as far as I can tell, is absolutely correct. All of that is out there, and it's despicable, and it's sickening, and it's very troubling. Also for British society, I think a society that manifests these symptoms, personally, is on a spiral downwards that maybe nothing can cure. It's a sure symptom, as is true in France too, and other places that manifest this. But not at these levels, where you're talking about security issues, you're talking about how to deal with terrorism, and there's a slow but sure realization that anti-Semitism is related to these things because you see it right before your eyes. So the people who work, for instance, in intelligence, they don't have to worry about getting elected, about how they appear in front of an electorate or the so-called opinion makers, you know, who invariably get almost everything wrong. And so I think there's a huge difference there. So the world, to a certain extent, and way beyond Europe, take India. I mean, Israel is getting closer by the day to India. A lot of that is connected with our common needs, common enemies, and the way that India perceives its security environment. And Israel has a tremendous amount to offer. And of course, India has other things to offer Israel.
And Korea also today, as we have some representatives.
Yeah, just to quickly answer your question, though, there was a poll published. It was covered by most of the major media in the UK a few weeks ago. They asked the British which countries they find most favorable and which countries in the world they find least favorable. North Korea was the least favorable country according to the survey of British public opinion. The second least favorite, Israel. Lower than Iran in terms of favorability amongst the British public. So I think there you see the seepage, the influence of the opinion makers and the British media in views of Israel. So I think there's a big difference between the government and the people in that regard.
I had correspondence with the foreign minister, the last foreign minister, Hay, and William Hay, asking why he persisted in the midst of the so-called Arab Spring in vilifying Israel as the Jewish nation that was causing trouble to the world, right? Die Juden sind unser Unglück, very similar to the Nazi idea, really. And he replied in a long letter that came via my local MP saying that despite what was going on in the Middle East, if the troubles with the Palestinians could be solved, that would be the key to everything.
So I'm sure you'll agree it's been a very illuminating evening, and we have a lot of work to do. UK Media Watch is clearly on top of these events and these issues. You know where to turn. You can get the materials outside. I'd like to thank our panelists, Professor Robert Wistrich, Adam Levick, Tadar Sella, and Lucille Cohen. Again, you have activism at its best here, and again, thank you all for coming. Please do take the materials outside and get going on the work.